I am Lucila Carvalho, and I work at Massey University in New Zealand. I have, before coming to New Zealand, I came to New Zealand about 5 years ago. Before coming here, I was in Australia for 15 years, but I am originally from Brazil. So I'm going to do my PPH in a minute. And talk a little bit about that. But my area of expertise is basically in digital education and networked learning and design for learning, which is what I am going to be talking about today. So I'm really happy to be here today and to share some ideas with you all. So I'm just going to share my screen. And then I can do my Can you see it? Oh, so ana koutou katoa, ko Cantarera te mawanga, ko Tiete te awa, ko Portugal te whenua o Kutipuna, ko Lucila Carvalho tōku ingoa, no reira, tēnā koutou katoa. I came to New Zealand, as I said, 5 years ago, and so a few months ago, I was doing a talk and I included my PP how to introduce myself. And it was when I realized that when we are introducing ourselves over here, we are actually talking about our connections to physical environments. We are talking about our connections to land. So, you know, when I tell you about my mountain and my river and the land of my ancestors, I'm telling you where I'm coming from, but I'm telling you about the physicality of the environment that is important to me as well. So when I do that, and I think it's important just to mention this over here, because one of the things that we don't often think about when we think about online teaching and learning is how it connects to the materiality of the experience that it's included in this online experience. So I will be talking a little bit about that through the talk as well. So I divided this session today in 4 parts. So first, just a quick overview about networked learning and a little bit about the assumptions and principles that underpin the practice of networked learning as a field of study. And then more specific about how does that impact in terms of design generally, and then more specifically how does it need some Yes. So then more specific about ways of framing the complexity of teaching and learning situations these days. And then I will just show you a practical example of how you can apply these ideas with a group of teachers in school teachers here in New Zealand that came to a workshop. And then I imagine that you might choose or not to sort of discuss these ideas amongst yourselves in other opportunities. So when we think about the word networks, usually we use this word to talk about connections. So it's about key phenomena and their relationships. And there's many different types of networks that we can see around the world, right? So networks of expertise, how is the case over here, or professional networks and social networks and informal networks, transport networks, so again, physical networks as well, and obviously online networks as well. In the case of we all here, particularly in this group, what's interesting, I think, is that there are different layers. So you are all educators and you are all together sharing these ideas about, what you do with your students. Perhaps some strategies would cross over with pedagogical strategies in networked learning, but you are also learners because you are learning from each other, you're collaborating, participating, sharing ideas within this particular network. So in networked learning is a field of study and theory. So there's theory and practice into this area. It started around the 90s, and originally was from a group of academics in a university in the United Kingdom in England, at Lancaster University, that came up with this idea of incorporating ways of using technology where the students could communicate with each other. And then they came up with the first definition of networked learning, which is from 98 over here. And this has been a definition that is the most, used in terms of research out there. And it talks about the use of technologies to promote connections. So connections being a strong word in the definition, but also like that the connections are between the learners and other learners, the learners and the teachers, and between the learning community and its learning resources. But of course, like as we all know, technology at the time, or in the 90s, was very different from the types of technologies that we have today. So people wouldn't have a laptop or, mobile devices, iPads and smartphones and things like that. And most of the interactions that were happening back then were actually they were text-based, so discussion forums where people would sort of talk to each other, and like if you were going to access the internet, you had to use a dial-up connection. So everything was quite different. So since then, technology has evolved, but also the field has evolved. Something that started very much as connected to the use of technology in the university setting, then expanded to other areas. So nowadays you can find studies of networked learning in relation to all sorts of areas, so professional networks and informal learning and schools and all sorts of different areas. So at the beginning, the values and things that underpin the practice were very connected to democracy and education. So the work of Paulo Freire and with critical pedagogy, but also sort of humanistic approaches. And this idea of openness, so the open movement, was quite influential over here. And the main point was connected to students, self-determination and self-development. And there was an aspect that was about learning for the common good, for the advancement of society, if you want, through these critical understandings of key issues. So at this very beginning, in terms of the value position, networked learning was emphasizing knowledge as being socially constructed, with a lot of emphasis on this dialogical and relational type of aspects, right? So through conversations. And the idea was, that meaning making would be related to how it contribute, like for transformative, transforming society, or like acting. And of course, this has implications for pedagogy and design, because it connects to issues of power and voice and access and inclusion, because the ideals at the time was that everybody should be having access to knowledge and information, and was all about empowering learners. And in terms of pedagogy, obviously, it would be something that emphasizes collaborative or collaboration, participation. So strategies such as, like problem-based learning or project-based learning, active learning would sort of be privileged in these types of situations. So a few years later, so in 2006 and then again in 2019, Vivian Hodgson and David McConnell published this article with the principles underpinning networked learning. So they talk about how learning has to be something that has perceived value for learners, that the responsibility for the learning process is to be shared between the members of the network. There's quite an emphasis on conviviality, on the relationships, and an awareness that you need time to develop this, to build these relationships. The idea that learning is situated and context dependent, the emphasis on collaboration and group activity, And so through dialogue and social interaction, we are always co-constructing knowledge and identity and learning. And of course, still the critical reflexivity angle, and with the role of the facilitator or animator, as they say, or the teacher, right? Still having an emphasis, playing a role, like being quite important, not only in terms of having a presence, but also in terms of designing for what students actually will be doing, right? So more recently, many academics from the field got together again and then to rethink their definition back from the 90s, right? Thinking about what was not so clear, or how could those, the main aspects of the definition be made more explicit. And you can see in this definition over here, so they wrote a paper that's called Inviting Redefinition. And then there's a response paper as well from many people from the networked learning community from different areas of research that sort of talk about, the evolution of networked learning and the sort of ideas in this field nowadays. But this new definition, as you can see, sort of incorporates many of the principles that I just talked about. So it talks about networked learning as involving processes of collaborative, cooperative, and collective inquiry. It mentions knowledge creation and knowledge action. So the idea that, you still have this transformative aspect, trusting relationships, so the conviviality of that's present in amongst people from the network. And the idea that needs to be motivated by a sense of a shared challenge and enabled by the convivial technologies. So what is key over here basically is that this, for me at least, this is three main pillars, right? So it's about the human interpersonal relationships. The technology is there, but especially for facilitating communications between people, and collaboration is still quite present, and it acts on here in terms of people engaging in joint inquiry and have this aspect of knowledgeable action, like I talked about before. But so more recently, people are returning to these ideas of the critical pedagogies and the humanistic approach, particularly looking at the equality and inclusion, and but also sort of critiquing a little bit this notion of when you are learning online, is something that you can do anywhere or at any time. So Jean Bain, who is a scholar from the University of Edinburgh, wrote this book called The Manifesto for Teaching Online, which is mainly connected to teaching in higher education, but I think there's quite a lot of crossovers in terms of, teaching in general, right? But what they are talking about is how this idea of the online representing anywhere or anytime and having this fantasy that is unbounded by the material and temporal constraints, like that is all fluid and flexible and available to everybody. So it was a critique of this thing about the democratization and diversification, because it doesn't necessarily acknowledge that the materiality or the material infrastructures actually play a very important role as well, because not everybody has access to the same type of infrastructure, materials, and devices that other people might have. And this kind of became quite evident during COVID-19, not just here in New Zealand, but everywhere, all around the world. There were this is from UNESCO, so it's 1.6 billion people that were sort of affected by the pandemic. And once people went into, trying to give some continuity to the learning processes of these students that couldn't, have to be in lockdown, what was revealed was that there were a lot of people that didn't necessarily have the same access to devices, or households where people had one device with many different people trying to share, and all the complications that came to that. So the idea that not all students have access to the internet or devices, but also the teachers that were not so familiar with this remote learning, right? Teaching and learning, and other issues connected to, you know, budget and the financing, you know, the solutions that could be offering continuity to learning. So this is just a quick kind of overview about the field, and just to mention that if you're interested in learning or in reading a little bit more, Springer publishes a book series only with research in networked learning, and you can see there's many different volumes over there, and there's all sorts of different subjects. So there's quite a few books about networked learning in terms of being professional learning, but also to different areas of research and all sorts of topics that might be of interest. So just moving to the design, so how do we design for networked learning, right? So when we think about design, there's different angles that we can approach over here. So we can come from the macro level. And in this case, we could be thinking about in terms of government policies and theories and best practices, and the large infrastructure that might need to be in place for, you know, what we do with our students. You can also think about these issues in terms of the meso level. The meso level is usually the institutional level. So it relates to the mission and strategies of your institution, your school, or your university. Can be connected to issues of curriculum and courses and how they connect to each other, or building facilities or platforms that you use to interact with your learners. And at the micro level is sort of the specific and local. So is the work that you as an educator will be doing in terms of choosing the tools, the resources, the spaces that you have available to interact with your students, how you organize your students socially, and the learning tasks that you ask your students to do. So when you think about, you know, what are some of the good things for our students to do, you might consider, you know, we want your students to learn about X or Y, but then within that, you might think that you would like to include some moments for individual reflection, for learning and sharing ideas, for co-creation of knowledge, collaboration, etc. But then you can also think about these things in a single session or across a number of weeks in a semester, within the degree or within the course, or in relation to a disciplinary body of knowledge, or how this is ultimately preparing your students for working and living in society. But of course, what you think your students, you know, the learning tasks that you're going to give to your students is not the only thing. So if you are in a physical environment, you also have to be accounting for the materiality of the space that you are sort of allocated to. So you might have a classroom that looks like that, where, you know, the pretty much like a classroom where I went to school, where, you know, the teacher is at the front and students are sitting in rows. And of course, in New Zealand, there are many different types of classrooms, and many of them have the flexible spaces these days where you have sort of light furniture and tables with wheels, which allow the teachers to sort of reorganize the space in different ways. And the technology, which is also kind of present in this space. And even if you are in a flexible space, you might still be socially organizing your students in a one-to-many type of, you know, situation, where you have this, you know, talking in a lecturing type of format, if you want. But your students might also be working in pairs, or individually, or in groups. And what you see in these pictures, in all of them, in the sequence of images, is that the technology, even in the physical space, is also there, is also present in many sort of spaces these days. And with the technology, what you have is the digital connections. So the kids are not just over here in the physical space, but they are also like connecting to other places, to other people, or to, you know, themselves. They might be talking to each other and not really using their voice, but in WhatsApp or something. But what about the online environment? Then what about teaching and learning online, right? So here we also have the different types of configurations. You can still have the one-to-many type of situation as we have here in the hybrid format, right? Where some people might be at home, others might be commuting, or might be at the library, in different types of physical space. And with some people at the library over there, and I am here at my house, right? And I be still interacting with each other. But you also have this dimension of across time. So if you're having teaching and learning that is asynchronous, so you might be having a conversation with someone that starts on Tuesday and someone contributes on Wednesday and then somebody else replies on Saturday. So the conversation happens across a period of time. So for us, as we think about then, how do we sort of what would be good things for our students to do, and how do we want them to interact with each other? We also have to remember that we have to scaffold the learning process over time, and that within this scaffolding, we also need to include the digital, the use of the technology. And this model over here is from Julie Salmon. And what I like about it is that she talks about the bit in red is kind of the technology, and the bit in blue is kind of the teacher. But what I like is that it's over time, you sort of get your students acquainted to the technology. So you start really with the basics of introducing it and making sure that people have access, and they know how to be in that particular space. And then how is it important to have the conviviality aspect, right? So that people can actually participate then in terms of sharing ideas and knowledge, and to be collaborating and co-constructing, etc. And many times what we imagine is the perfect situation, right? Like our students are, in this quiet space with all equipped with technology. And if they are sharing this space, they have, supporting siblings or parents, and everything is kind of is smoothly running, but not necessarily this might be the case. Sorry. Not necessarily this might be the case. So many times people might have different types of situations that of what we imagine, and maybe dealing with different things in the physical environment. And one of the things that I like, one of the quotes that I really like is this from Peter Gutierrez, and it's actually in his blog page. And he talks about how this dichotomy between online versus face-to-face is unhelpful, because learning doesn't happen online. It actually happens where the learner is. So it's really important that we acknowledge the digital and the material resources that kind of like, and look at how those elements can have subtle and powerful influence in learning activity. And this is something also that Leslie Goulet talks about. So she talks about in terms of that all aspects of the digital engagement are, in fact, grounded in material and embodied entanglements, and sort of they are connected to different devices and other artifacts as well. So when we think about the devices and things and what we're going to do with our students, we have to be aware that there's all these dependencies of devices to other devices, and cables and electricity and power and Wi-Fi and satellites, and that all of those things are actually have an effect in what we actually do with our students as well. So when we think about design, it's quite complex and involves so many elements. And it's, yes, we have the learning objectives. I mean, all our planning about, who will do what and when, and using what tools and resources, and with whom, and with the, intention of reaching what outcomes in mind. And it's all these elements that come together, right? That need to come together as we are designing for learning. So the thing is here is about how do we break this complexity of this teaching and learning and nowadays that involves so many different elements like people and tasks and digital and material tools. And in particular, many times as in the university environment, but I believe also in the school environments, we are many times talking about, what we're going to be doing with our students. We are co-designing with colleagues, or we are looking at how our subject area fits into across different subjects. So we are having all design conversations, right? And how do we know that we are actually having a shared understanding about what we are talking about, right? So a few years ago, as I was in Australia, I was working with Peter Gutierrez, and we worked in a project that involved thinking about the relationships, between learning, design, and technology. And one of the outcomes of the project was this framework, which is called Activity Analysis and Design Framework, or ACAD. And the framework is meant to help, educators, designers, learning designers, and also researchers to think about this complexity or this structure that involves all these many different elements. So if you think about as an educator, like you're going to be considering, what is the learning task that your students are going to be doing. So how are you going to be sequencing, the basing the knowledge and information that you want your students to learn about. But you also are going to be considering what are the artifacts, the tools, and the resources that your students are going to work with, like whether they are going to work with pen and paper, or they are going to use Google Docs or an iPad or a specific platform. And you also think about in terms of whether you're going to ask your students to be working in pairs or individually or in groups. And if they're going to be doing some group work, whether they are going to, you're going to be scaffolding that collaboration. So there's all these elements that as an educator, you're kind of making choices about, right? And as you make these choices, they become an assemblage of the elements. And then at learn time, like when your students interact with this assemblage of elements, they can then co-create and co-configure and change, interpret what is it that you are asking them to do. So we talk about that in terms of what students do and think and feel as an emergent activity. So it's what matters the most, and that's why it's in the center. But all the other elements are sort of the designable components. So are elements that you as an educator make choices about it. And we call them like a set design, epistemic design, and social design. And the activity of your students comes as a co-creation and co-configuration activity. And then more recently, we were sort of differentiating about these two moments, the design moment and the learning moment. So when you are designing, you are projecting, you are thinking about or imagining what your students will be doing in the future. So, and that's when you are making your choices for, the tools and the tasks and the social arrangements for your students. And then at learn time, the activity is then real, co-configured, and emergent, and the elements of design are then sort of inherited because they are choices that you have made beforehand, right? And then this work comes from Pippa Yeoman, who was also part of the project that we were working at the University of Sydney, and in her work, she was looking at using the dimensions of the ACAD framework in terms of set design, epistemic design, and social design, but looking at them in terms of different levels of granularity, like I talked at the beginning. So in terms of what happens at the macro level, what happens at the meso level, and what happens at the micro level. And this allows you to see, as part of your design, to see what happens at classroom level with you and your students, how this can be influenced by different elements at these different levels, meso level and macro level as well. So let's say at my university, one of the elements in the teaching and learning strategy is about active learning and emphasizing collaboration, etc. So let's say that I wanted to sort of honor that in my design with my students. So I imagine a learning session where I'm going to be doing an activity that involves concept mapping or concept map, and the students working in groups to sort of develop this concept map. And because I'm doing this online, right? So I'm going to be choosing to use some sort of platform, online platform, and I'm going to put them in breakout rooms, and they're going to use Miro. And so my students need to have digital devices and the internet, and it's important that they have, access to Wi-Fi, etc., so they can actually be synchronously online. And I can also think about the same situation in terms of the physical environment. So let's say that I am actually doing face-to-face classes at the university at Massey, and then I have planned the same type of activity, concept map, doing a group, but I was actually planning for them to do, because they're sharing the same physical space, with paper and pen. And then I am allocated a lecture theater, which has the fixed seats, which is not so conducive of group work. So what this allows us to see is where there is a little bit of a dissonance in terms of what I am aspiring in my design, and certain elements over here. And you can then consider what elements do you have less or more control, and how would you sort of adapt the situation in order so that your students can do what you have in mind, right? Or at least close to what you intend. And then another thing that I wanted to discuss over here is the cards. So another resource that we develop as part of this work with the ACAD framework as well has been sort of the materiality of these cards. So we were doing a lot of workshops with teachers and different types of people, but many of those workshops were related at the very beginning, related to the design of new learning spaces. So this is all a pre-COVID era, and universities were investing a lot of money into learning spaces, and they would bring all these people together, architects and lecturers and different types of people, to discuss, what the learning space, how the learning spaces should look like. And what we wanted was something that the people could talk about, design ideas, and make sure that they were sort of exchanging ideas and trying to get a shared understanding of what they meant. But they also are used as kind of like conversation starters, but also as kind of brainstorming ideas for design. So we have the four sets of cards. The blue cards are sort of the cards that for people to think about what is underpinning their design, what types of value, how do they think people learn, and what are sort of the underpinning values that should be included or should be addressed in the design that they are considering. And there's different examples of learning theories that we included in the cards. And if you want to see all the terms that are in the cards, they are in this article that I put it over there. And the main point over here is that if we are talking about social constructivism, what is it that is social constructivism? And so the people can sort of start these conversations and talk about those things that we kind of like give. It's almost like we don't engage in those types of conversations so much as we are sort of engaging in design, right? And then the other sets of cards reflect the design dimensions of the ACAD framework. So talk about in terms of epistemic design, set design, and social design. So looking at ideas for learning tasks and and the mode of instruction, and then ideas for tools and resources and spaces, and then ideas about types of social organization of students, and what can you actually do with in terms of organizing different types of activity, so in social arrangements. And these cards are kind of like they are very tangible, like and we have like a whole session about what the cards, holding the cards and shuffling the cards and all those types of things. But more recently, because of COVID, we stopped doing these face-to-face workshops, and we started doing these workshops online using Jamboard. And this is a link that I wanted to share with you, because you can sort of see it's a design space basically that has some of the terms in the cards, and you can sort of create your own new terms as well, and engage in these activities by thinking about different elements in your design. So I'm just going to share now a short example of a workshop that we did, I think it was last year. And this workshop, so you can see the practical application and how kind of the ideas flow into a design session. And so this was a workshop that we did with a group of teachers here from Auckland, and they were these teachers. They were teaching Chinese language in schools, and they were teachers and teacher aides. And the main theme of the symposium, so they came for a one-day kind of symposium, was about diversity. So when they came to our workshop, they already had a whole morning session about diversity, where they sort of had different speakers talking about diversity in the Chinese classroom. And so we set a few design tasks for them, for this group of teachers. And the group that I'm talking about over here is just one of the groups that had a mix of primary and school teachers. Altogether, we had, I think it was around maybe 25 teachers in this session, but this group over here was kind of 5 teachers. And they were sort of, so what we did was, we first start with the values, with the blue cards, right? In this case over here, we asked them to exchange ideas about diversity. So they had done a number of kind of sessions in the morning where they were sort of thinking about diversity. So this moment was for them to share, to synthesize the ideas that they had learned during the day, during the morning, and then sort of just talk about what did they understood, what was diversity for them, and then to get this shared understanding about them as a group, what would be diversity for them as a group, right? And once they had that, we then asked them to go in turns through the sets of cards. So we start with the yellow cards, which talks about the tasks, and collect ideas for potential tasks that they would like to be present in their design. So they do that, and then they move on to the orange cards, and they do the same thing. So considering, what they have selected in terms of the learning tasks, then now they would be thinking about the social design. And again, just going through the cards and discarding cards that they found that were not useful, and keeping the ones that they found that were interesting. And then doing the same thing with the tools and resources and the set design cards. And then again, selecting some to stay and some to go. And what this does is that as they get a card, like with a term, they start discussing, what is this? How can it be used? And they start kind of having a conversation. And the final task over here was to combine everything. So to get again into the cards that they have now then selected to be part of the design, and try to find what ideas could be incorporated through this brainstorm of ideas that they had collected. And what this group did was they decided that diversity in their design should be about accommodating different levels of proficiency, and also different levels of task complexity. And then these are kind of the terms that they sort of selected. So in terms of set design, I have classroom, exhibition space, simulation space, laptops, and paper. And in terms of social, they had idea generation, facilitator, learner, pairs, teams, and epistemic were related to assigned questions, brainstorming, collaborative problem solving, role playing, and worksheets. So what they designed was then they decided to do a mid-autumn festival. And then this was obviously to accommodate this idea of different levels of proficiency and task complexity, but they really wanted to have something about group work where every student, independent of their levels of proficiency, would feel valued. So they designed a lot of mini tasks that would be part of this broader task, and that each student would be doing something towards contributing, and then in combination they would see themselves as part of this event, right, this festival. And they are quite detailed in the type of design that they do, and sort of they have different kinds of tasks and things, but connected to these three main kind of teams and areas, right? So one was about performance and presenting stories of the Mid-Autumn Festival. Then the other one was organized in terms of looking at food organization and stalls for selling the food. And then finally, decoration and researching themes and about celebration and artwork creation. So I think this is kind of like just a quick example in terms of how these ideas can be used. Wrapping up all together, just so that we can have some time for some conversation. I think the important part of it here is to think about these materialities of the digital that that many times are influencing what students are doing, and we are perhaps not so aware that those things play a very important role. But then also this aspect that connects to the architecture of learning networks. So how this is actually about not looking at the whole complexity, but trying to identify what are the key elements and how sort of they come together to sort of have some sort of influence on what the students are actually doing, and noticing this relationship in terms of part and whole, because what we do at the micro level, with our students, are influenced by the meso and the macro level, and also vice versa. So that was me. So I hope if you have any questions, I'm just going to stop sharing.